It all started, in fact, when I went to an exhibition at the National Gallery, Nicholas Mass, Dutch master of the Golden Age, and that set me thinking, because I realized I hadn't really given a talk on that wonderful period of art, the Dutch Golden Age. So that was the basis of thinking about today's talk. Now, I discovered, unfortunately, it's a rather bigger subject than I thought. And I think I've got more slides to get through today than I've had before. Believe it or not, there were roughly 4 million, yes, 4 million paintings were produced during the Dutch Golden Age. So I've had to be a bit selective. And also I decided that I'd give a separate talk in September on Vermeer and on Dutch genre paintings. So that's to come, but let's get started. What I thought I would do is start by a little description of why the Dutch Golden Age, how it arose. And this is a scene, picture in the National Gallery. It's in 1568, that's before the scene represented here. It was the start of the 80 Years' War, which is also called the Dutch War of Independence. And that led to the creation of what became the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. And so the Dutch provinces declared their independence from Spain. And this small Dutch republic already had a worldwide network of trade routes through the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company. And the income allowed the small Dutch republic to compete with the much larger countries in Europe. It managed to amass a fleet of 2,000 ships, which was larger than the English and the French navies combined. And although it was Protestant, it allowed freedom of thought. And so it attracted and encouraged people. The greatest thinkers of Europe came to Holland. And it was advanced in science as well, partly because of that. And so the Dutch Golden Age lay in the strength of the Dutch provinces, which lay in their international trade, having the greatest thinkers in Europe and the largest navy. And in fact, this shows one of the pictures, in this picture, one of the ships of the Dutch Navy, the Eendracht, meaning harmony. And we think it might be a representation of a battle that took place with the British in 1665. And in fact, the Eendracht was blown up and sank with all crew on board, including the admiral. A few years after this, 1672 is an important year because that is usually regarded as the end of the Dutch Golden Age, and the Dutch call it the rampjaar, or disaster year. And partly because the French, with the help of the English, invaded and overran the Dutch Republic. It survived, but it declined from that point on. Although in 1688, of course, the Dutch mobilized their navy and the army, successfully invaded England and replaced the king. But that's another story. So the period I'm talking about sort of ends roughly around 1672. So let's get started. One of the great painters of the Golden Age at the beginning, and I'll be going roughly chronologically through the Golden Age, is Pieter Paul Rubens. This is he. And he ran a large workshop in Antwerp. Antwerp, incidentally, was at the beginning of the 16th century, 40% of all the trade in Europe went through the port of Antwerp, but it started to decline and it was replaced by Amsterdam as the major trading center. But it was still an important port, and that's where Rubens was based. The interesting thing about this painting is that it was supplied to Charles when he was Prince of Wales, Charles I, as a sort of peace offering. Now, Rubens had painted something called Lion Hunt, which has since been lost, for a patron, an English patron, but he didn't know it was going to be given to the Prince of Wales. When Charles received it, Charles was a very discerning collector, a connoisseur. He sent it back with a note that says, "Piece scarce touched by his own hand," meaning, hold on a minute, just sent me something which Rubens didn't paint. And he was right. It was painted mostly by Rubens's workshop, which was common. But if Rubens had known who it was going to be sent to, so he was embarrassed. And so what he did is he sent this self-portrait to Charles. He wasn't sure, he was a bit worried about sending a self-portrait to a king, but it worked. Or in fact, he was a prince at that time, to a prince. It was well received. So, and it's still in the Royal Collection. Remember this from before. This is Susanna London, and it's in the National Gallery. And on the right is portrait of a woman, which is in the Royal Collection. But I showed you these when we were talking about the collection of George IV, if you remember. So what I'd like to do is to show you this painting by Rubens, the Rainbow Landscape. Remember before I showed you Het Steen. This was another landscape that he painted. He didn't paint a lot of landscapes, but when he retired, he became wealthy and he bought a manor house called Het Steen, and he painted the manor house in the one I showed you before, and he painted this panoramic view of the countryside around the house. And he spent his summers there when he semi-retired between 1636 and 1640 when he died. So the last 4 years of his life was spent at Het Steen. And he loved it there. He could relax there. And remember, he was also a diplomat. So he led a stressful life traveling around Europe, negotiating with kings. And what he's done here is he's brought together all the good things, if you like, of the countryside. There's haymaking going on. There's some ducks quacking over on the right. There's someone driving the cows to market. There's a man with two good-looking women perhaps going off to market in the center. Everyone's having a good time. And above it all, there's God's covenant to man, the rainbow. In fact, it's a double rainbow. As it says in Genesis, I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Now, Rubens' most important pupil was Van Dyck, Anthony Van Dyck, who became a court painter. And so, by the way, I'm using the twist like this when I change from one artist to another to indicate when the artist is changing. This was painted at the height of his fame when he was principal painter to Charles I. The language of flowers wasn't yet fully developed as it was later, particularly in the Victorian period, but we do know that a sunflower meant devotion or fidelity because it follows the sun. The gold chain he's wearing was a present from Charles I. So one interpretation of this painting is that it's he's showing his devotion to and loyalty to his patron, the king. He had wealthy parents. Van Dyck was a child prodigy. He was an accomplished artist by the age of 15. So when he was an apprentice to Rubens, he was more or less his chief assistant, even though he was young. And Rubens described him as the best of all my pupils. As I said, Rubens was in Antwerp, so Van Dyck was working in Antwerp at that time. But it was a declining city, and he went to England in 1620. And it was in England, actually, that he saw Titian, which was transformed the way he painted. And in fact, he spent 6 years living in Italy. He always, as he does here, presents himself as a nobleman, and he did in the streets of London as well. He would wear silks and feathers and brooches, gold chains, and would always be accompanied by servants. He thought a lot of himself. He was an immediate success, and this was one of the reasons. He was very good at painting someone accurately, but flattering them at the same time. Charles is a good example here. Charles I was less than 5 foot tall, but you wouldn't know it from this picture. He's mounted high on a horse. His queen, Henrietta Maria, had protruding teeth, but you would never see anything like that in Van Dyck's paintings. He painted something like 40 portraits of Charles and 30 of the Queen. And here we see him. One of the other reasons he's on the horse is not just to raise him up, but because at the time, controlling a horse was a metaphor for being in control of yourself and your life, and in this case, being in control of the state. So it's a metaphor for how the king is able to control the state as easily as he can control a horse. And he's alongside him is his French master of the horse and equerry. But that, of course, was painted in England. Let me show you. Well, this is called Laughing Cavalier, even though, of course, he isn't laughing and he's not a cavalier. I'll explain in a moment how he got the name. It's, of course, Frans Hals, and he was one of the painters of the Haarlem school. The Dutch painters were divided into types of painting they produced, like they might be a flower painter, a genre painter, a portrait painter mostly, although they sometimes produced other types, like as we saw, Peter Paul Rubens painted landscapes, but he wasn't really a landscape painter. He was a portrait painter. And there was what we call the fine schilder, or fine painters, and they were also divided by the town. So there was the school of Delft, like Vermeer. There was the Haarlem school, which included Frans Hals. And there were guilds in each of the towns as well. This, we believe, is a betrothal portrait, because if you look closely, you'll see his costume he's wearing contains arrows, flaming cornucopia, lovers' knots. And so it's a sort of courtship costume, a betrothal portrait. And recently, we don't really know, but recently the sitter has been suggested is Tilman Rosterman, a wealthy Haarlem textile merchant. Incidentally, Frans Hals was very popular at the time, but fell into obscurity, and he was revived, his reputation was revived by this painting in 1865, in the Victorian period, when it was bought for the equivalent of £2,000, exhibited in England. And it was then that it was given this name, the Laughing Cavalier. So that's how it arose in the Victorian period, much later. It's in the Wallace collection now. And I'm showing you this by Frans Hals as a different type of painting. It's called the Gypsy Girl, but it's not a portrait. It's what they called at the time a trony. And in the 16th and 17th century, the Dutch word trony meant face. So it's a face picture. And these tronies were very popular. People hung them on their walls, and they expressed human qualities. For example, it might be wisdom or strength, racial types like this one, a gypsy, or a soldier, like an occupation, or maybe simply old age or youth. We'll see an old age by Rembrandt, a trony. They were collected and valued by art lovers, and all the Dutch at the time were art lovers. People had, the reason there were 4 million paintings produced is that every house was full of paintings. All the walls were full of paintings. They estimate something like every house had an average of 10 paintings. Switching artist, this is Clara Peters. Still life with fish, a candle, artichokes, crab and prawns. And this, she was an innovative painter, very popular. And this is the earliest dated still life of fish. And these types of painting, like a painting of fish, became a sort of a type of painting that people would want to buy. So more people wanted to own fish paintings. And one of the reasons is, of course, that it's a fishing nation, the Dutch, and one of the most common, and also for religious reasons, one of the most common meals was fish. But the paintings of this type were introduced by Clara Peters. All of her works, like this one, are very carefully executed, and detail, texture, the surface of materials became very important to a lot of painters and to the Dutch. They like to see a sort of skill in painting. It's one of the reasons paintings were bought, for the art demonstration of the artist's skill. Let me show you another one of her works. It's a bit hard to see, but up here, there's actually a self-portrait of her in the reflection. But if we look at the next work, it's clearer. I'll show you in a moment, an enlargement. This is cheese. And this fruit, cheese, expensive food was another type of painting called a banketje, or in other words, a banquet in Dutch. We don't know the symbolism of all this, but a lot of the paintings did have symbolism. It could be it's an encouragement to temperance, or it could be a reference to the Last Supper, or it could be a display of opulence and wealth, or maybe all of them. The one thing to note is the knife down the bottom. I'll show you an enlargement. It's got her name. She's painted it as if it's engraved on the side, and it's hanging over the table. One reason artists did that is because it makes us feel that it's part of our space. And so the painting becomes part of the part of our space. It brings us into the painting. And I said I'd show you the self-portrait by enlarging this this up here. I see someone's. Let me just mute everyone again. I heard someone's voice. Right. You can see her. This is her headpiece or hat. These are her eyes here. This is her face reflected. And in fact, a number is one of her things she did, a number of her pictures. She paints a tiny, see it up there, a tiny little self-portrait. Another little sort of way of signing the painting. Flower painting. This is Rachel Ruysch, and she was one of the leading flower painters. You'll notice, by the way, when I say flower paintings, they often have fruit and insects, and I'll explain why in a moment. She was incredibly successful. In fact, a painting like this would sell for something like twice what they would pay for a Rembrandt of the same size. She had a very long career. She started painting and selling her paintings in her teens, and she lived and was still painting in her 80s, so 60 years of painting or more. So why was flower painting so popular? Well, obviously it's attractive. It's an enduring substitute for the real thing. It's a demonstration of the artist's skill, which was much admired in the accuracy and lifelike representation of the flowers. It was also a reminder of wealth and global reach of the Dutch Empire, because they often included flowers that had been brought back from around the world by Dutch traders. You also might be reminded of tulip mania, which was between 1634 and 1637. And I'll illustrate and talk a little bit more about that later. And so the Dutch loved flowers and valued flowers. They included, as I said, fruit and insects, flies, beetles, ladybirds, caterpillars, butterflies and moths, lizards even, and mice. And sometimes the blossoms are damaged. Sometimes the fruit is rotting or starting to go off. And this represents the transience of earthly existence, but also this interest and curiosity about the world. This scientific interest was because the world, as represented here, is a representation of God's glorious creation. And it was a time in Holland when scientists like Antony van Leeuwenhoek had started experimenting with lenses, using microscopes, opened up a whole new world of the tiny world, expanded the view of God's work on earth. So it had religious significance. So briefly, why did people buy flower paintings? It was a substitute for the real thing, a record of a luxury object, a celebration of the Dutch Empire and Dutch trading, scientific wonders, masterpieces of illusion, demonstration of taste and wealth, a moral signpost from God, and a memento mori, a reminder that we all have to die. So a lot of reasons why they were so popular. Let me switch to a different type of painting. This is Honthorst. Gerrit van Honthorst, you will have seen his painting at Hampton Court. I'll show you later if you just think about where you've seen it at Hampton Court. This is a very different, this is the Procuress, Venal Love, the Procuress. And this was another very popular subject. What we see here, and the Procuress was nearly always represented as an ugly old woman with a headscarf on, wound into a turban. She's the one on the left here. And she was the matchmaker who negotiated between the client, whose back is to us here, and the woman, the prostitute. And in society, the procuress, the matchmaker, was an outcast. They didn't mix in polite society. So they weren't usually portrayed in a particularly flattering manner. But what's going on here? Well, it's fairly obvious, but if I show you a close-up, there's a transaction taking place. The hands are almost, but not quite touching. He has his purse out. In his hand, you can see here coins, and he's just about to hand over the coins as a deal has been struck. And that's indicated by the shadows on the lute. Now, the lute was regarded as an erotic symbol because it was seen, I don't quite know why, but it was seen to represent the female body. And also music was thought to excite the passions. And we see their two hands have merged together on the erotic symbol of the lute. And that's that would be understood by everybody who bought these paintings at the time. This is the one that you will have seen at Hampton Court on the Queen's Staircase. A very large picture, this one, over 6.5 meters across. And what's going on here, I'll just go through it quickly. It's an allegorical painting by Honthorst when he was in England, and it's up here. This is Charles I and Henrietta Maria representing Apollo and Diana, looking down on this person here is the Duke of Buckingham as Mercury, leading forward his wife. Yes, this is the Duchess of Buckingham. She can be bare-breasted because she's representing grammar, and grammar is the leading liberal arts, and she's followed by the other 6 of the 7 liberal arts, which are logic and rhetoric, the 3 representing the trivium, the most important of the 7 liberal arts, and then the remaining 4 liberal arts, the quadrivium of astronomy here, geometry, arithmetic, and music with a lute. And down the bottom, there are, instead of cupids, there is these young children. These over here, we are, if you look, there's a figure here and a figure here. We think these are evil and possibly hate being driven away. And this is a goat being driven away, representing, I think, bestial appetites which keep one from studying. So this is all to do with an appreciation and understanding of the 7 liberal arts on the part of the King Charles I. And this is Jan van Bruegel, the younger, satire on tulipomania, which I mentioned earlier. And he's representing, he's making, the satire is based on using monkeys to represent the people who dealt in tulips. This one over here is pointing to the flowering tulips, I guess trying to sell them to this one here. And this is all a satire on the tulip mania, the economic bubble that burst in the 1637. Over here, there's someone holding a tulip. I think he's just bought, because this is his bag of money. This one is writing down a trade that's taken place. The owl, by the way, represents foolishness and ignobility. This one over here is looking through a list of the names of bulbs that he's thinking of buying. And over here, these are people who've sold some tulip bulbs, counting the money. But this is what's happened after the crash. And these are people being taken to court. This is representing a courtroom here. This is the monkey is peeing on some tulips here, following the crash and being left with some worthless tulips. And in the background, there's actually a funeral cortege here, a monkey being buried, and various other things going on. So a satire on the whole tulip mania bubble. Rembrandt. Perhaps one of the most famous of the Dutch Golden Age artists. He painted this when he was 23, and you probably have seen it because it's at Hampton Court. It's part of the Royal Collection. He painted it when he was still in Leiden, before he moved to Amsterdam to develop his career further. And a master, as you can see, when he was 23, of light, highlighting the face, the detail of the skin, the taut mouth, the purple velvet hood, the fur around her neck. And this, with 2 others, was the first Rembrandt to enter the British collection when they were presented to Charles I. And they're still in the Royal Collection, which is why it's at Hampton Court. It's on loan from the Royal, part of the Royal Collection. And now we think this is his mother, but it's a trony. So it's not intended as a portrait of his mother. She often modeled for him when he was in Leiden, though. And it's a study of an elderly person. So this trony is about old age. And the tronies, as I said, were sought after by collectors. Now, when he's just moved to Amsterdam when he painted this a couple of years before, and it was by then the most prosperous port in Northern Europe, crowded with merchants and, in other words, buyers of paintings, and it offered far more opportunities than Leiden, and he made a fortune, and of course, as we know, lost a fortune in Amsterdam. Now, during his early years, he painted biblical and mythological scenes, and this is a biblical scene, Storm on the Sea of Galilee, and it's sort of in a way emulating the style of Rubens, but he got many portrait commissions as well. He married a wealthy cousin of his landlord, Saskia van Eulenberg. His reputation grew. He received very prestigious commissions, including perhaps his most famous, The Night Watch. In some ways, perhaps this is the most famous painting of the Dutch Golden Age. It's enormous size, it's 4.5 meters wide, dramatic lighting, a prestigious commission. But it's not just, many of these group portraits were static, but he's managed, Rembrandt has brought in this dynamism into the scene. It's being, the troop is being led out by Captain Koch and his lieutenant, and our eyes move around the painting. I'll just pick on one thing, the high-lit women behind them down here. You might, wearing a dead chicken. Have you noticed? See, these are the legs of the chicken. This is the chicken here, and it's sort of tied round her waist. And so I'll just concentrate on the chicken. Why a dead chicken? Well, we think it's because of the claws, which was kloven in Dutch, and that was like the Cavaliers were another name for the infantrymen. So it's a sort of a pun, if you like, on infantrymen, but also dead chicken represents the defeated enemy, and yellow, the color of her dress, signifies victory. So it's a little metaphor, a little symbolic meaning in the middle, that the infantrymen around will defeat the enemy and be victorious. Young woman bathing in a river or stream. It's possible it's Hendricka Stoffel's. She joined Rembrandt's household when his wife Saskia, remember I said he married Saskia van Eulenberg, after she died, in fact, he had a live-in housekeeper who became his lover called Geerte Dyck. But when Stoffels joined the household, he dropped Dyck, who sued him for breach of promise and demanded maintenance payments, but somehow he managed to get her put away, and he became lovers with Stoffels, possibly this woman here, but they were unable to marry because Saskia had left a will which basically would have bankrupted Rembrandt if they'd married, because if he married, all of his money would go to their son, Titus. And Stoffels became pregnant this year. This was painted and suffered public humiliation because she was pregnant outside marriage. But let's move on. Judith Lester was very highly regarded amongst painters of what's called genre works, of which there were many different types. She also painted portraits and still life. Although she was forgotten after her death, she was very popular in the Dutch Golden Age, but after years passed, she was completely forgotten. And in fact, all of her works were attributed to either Frans Hals or her husband, who was an artist, Molenaar, until there was a court case in the Victorian period in 1893. Frans Hals was sold to the Louvre, and the artist who painted it was questioned, and they found the signature JL, and scholars realized that it was painted by Judith Lester, and then they found JL, the signature JL, on lots of more paintings, and her reputation grew from that point on. She became a member of, she was born in Haarlem and became a member of the Haarlem Guild of St. Luke. And as I said, she married an artist, and they moved together to Amsterdam. But let me tell you what's going on in this this painting. It's a reference to an old Dutch proverb. We don't know all the Dutch proverbs, but we know some. This proverb is, "He who plays with cats gets scratched." In other words, if you look for trouble, you're going to find it. So what's going on here? Notice the little girl has got her hand around the cat's tail. She's teasing the cat. She's just about to pull the cat's tail, and the cat is then going to get mad and scratch them. So the boy is typically, it was believed that little girls were innocent, and the boy is egging her on, and she's giving a wicked smile, I think, and the boy is sort of half guilty. I don't know why he's holding an eel. Maybe he used it to tease the cat because the cat wanted to eat it and he took it away. I don't know. But the cat's just at the point of getting very angry. That's what's going on here. David Tenier the Younger, a Kermis on St. George's Day. Now, when I was talking about George IV, who bought a lot, he liked Dutch Golden Age paintings and bought a lot. I showed you peasants dancing outside a tavern, but this work, a Kermis on St. George's Day, he also bought. And in fact, it was this painting that was the most expensive in George IV's collection. He paid 1,500 guineas for it. And you might be wondering, what's a Kermis? It's a summer fair, which was held every year in towns and villages throughout the Netherlands. But this is representing, as often the case with these paintings, if you look carefully, you'll find a lot of joyful goings on, but also a lot of vices. So there's lots of moral lessons, and that's the intention. These are moral pieces teaching lessons. There's lust here. See, this man is trying to molest this woman who's pushing his hand away. It's a bit difficult to see, but there's a fight going on in the back here, and two men are being held apart. Wrath. There's drunkenness. There's a figure asleep here, and there's general sloth. There's daily behavior. These two men here, what's going on here is they've just reached a deal and they're sealing the bargain. There's high spirits, there's dancing, so there's fun as well. And this chap here perhaps is the village elder who's looking on with, what should we call it, indulgent wisdom. He's seen it all before. So his all of life is here type of painting. Again, there's a moral here. It's called A Cottage by a River with a Distant View of Castle, but we don't know whether it's an actual castle. It hasn't been identified. So it's just a generic scene as far as we know. But the interesting thing here is the three people here. The woman who's cleaning pot turns, the young woman turns to look at the older man, who turns to look at her. So the implication is there's something going on between them, but there's an older woman caught them looking at each other, possibly his wife looking out of the door. And so there's a moral lesson here. And Tenier became internationally known in his lifetime. He was extremely popular and sold a lot of paintings around Europe. He was born in Antwerp, and he produced scenes like this of John scenes and scenes of fashionable life. Well, let's move on to, because I wanted to show you this final picture by David Tenier, because it's a more obvious version of the previous one. This is old peasant caressing a kitchen maid in a stable. So he's not just looking, he's stopped her in her work. She's cleaning that pot with the straw in her hand. He's pulling her away, and in fact her shoe here has fallen off. So something is about to happen, except that this woman has just come in the door and caught them at it. And so it's a warning. And as I said, these types of painting were hung on people's walls, not as a celebration or representation of everyday life, but as a warning against ungodly, immoral behavior. The devil could seduce us at any time, so we must always be on our guard. But typically these paintings were sold to middle class, and this is a lower class. So in other words, they could put this on the wall and feel a distance from it. It's not the sort of thing that they would do. They would be upright and have immaculate manners. It's the sort of thing that a peasant in a barn might do. But on the other hand, it is a warning to us all that we should avoid these situations. But they did arise. Gerard ter Borch, the younger, the suitor's visit. Now, ter Borch was a master of psychological subtlety and also of painting technique. Just on the technique, silk satin was regarded as the hardest material to capture because it reflects the light. It doesn't just scatter it. And ter Borch was the master of painting silk satin, which you can see here. One of the problems was, if you used a model, a human being as a model, they inevitably they would move and all the creases would change and all the reflections would change. And so what artists would do, who were concerned about capturing the exact look, was to use a mannequin and hang the clothes, because they could leave the clothes untouched for days and capture the creases and folds precisely. One of the little techniques he used, by the way, to highlight the sheen on the silk was that he would darken the middle tones to increase the contrast between the highlights, say here, and the shadows just here. And just by increasing the darkness of the shadow slightly, it increases the strength of the apparent reflection of light. But anyway, I'm getting off the main point I wanted to make, and that is, it looks to us as though it's a gentleman half bowing to a lady, and he's just entered the music room where another lady is playing the lute, and a man looks on a bit suspiciously. So why suspiciously? Well, the Dutch would have seen something that I don't know whether you've seen. Can you spot it? There's a signal taking place between them. And I've got an enlargement here to help you. So I'll just pause, try and spot it. Yes, the hand gestures. Look at her hand. She's thrusting her thumb between two of her fingers, and he accepts by making a circle with his thumb and forefinger. By the way, this doesn't mean that she has accepted him. It was written that women would frequently, typically tease men. So that's but that would all be understood at the time. But it's the gestures that I wanted to point out to you, because if just looking at this painting, you might not have noticed them. Gerrit Douw was a pupil of Rembrandt, although he rarely travelled outside Leiden. And he was invited to England actually by Charles, who wanted to get all the best artists in England, but found it difficult to attract artists to England. And he was much sought after. And his reputation did last into the 18th and 19th century. Remember, we saw Grocer's Shop, which was bought by George IV. Well, this is a different shop. This is Poulterer's Shop. And again, he's using this stone arch. By the way, a poulterer wouldn't operate in such a fancy shop with this carved bas relief down here and this grand stone arch. It's to increase it's to frame it and to increase the sort of prestige of the situation for the purchaser of the painting. And it's got a strong sense of narrative. The two figures here, two in the background, and there's a lot going on. Although I don't think in this case, I think it's a representation of food and a daily transaction rather than a moral point. It was painted in 1670 as relevant because remember 1672 is called the disaster year. It was the start of the Franco-Dutch War, and it led to the rapid decline of Holland as a world power. In fact, the Vermeer's wife said that after 1672 he could hardly sell anything, and most painters found that their business dropped off dramatically after 1672, which is why it's normally given as the end of the Dutch Golden Age. Kuyp, I pronounce it Kuyp, but a more accurate, if you say closer, in other words, to the Dutch, is Kalp. Kalp. But I tend to say Kuyp. Albert Kuyp is known for his, like this one, peaceful landscapes. This is in the National Gallery. And his use of light and creation of an atmosphere, peaceful scenes, a celebration of the Dutch landscape with its flat, although he's got hills here, but in its big skies. He actually lived and worked in Rome for several years, so I think he might have been inspired by the Italian countryside. Another Kuyp in the Royal Collection. Again, this one was purchased by George IV. Low perspective, flat area over to the left, enormous skies, a peaceful scene, and using Kuyp's technique to highlight these key elements by using the low sun to just light up one side to bring them out to separate the foreground, middle ground and background to give it depth. And then finally, this is more like a Dutch scene here. In fact, it's called A Distant View of Dordrecht, with a milkmaid and 4 cows and other figures. And Kuyp was the leading, well, in fact, together with Jacob van Redisdale, they were the leading painters of Dutch landscape. And it was a popular type of painting to have on your wall. Kuyp was born in Dordrecht and died there. He, in fact, inherited a fortune, and so he was only active for about 20 years, about 1639 to 1660, the high point of the Dutch Golden Age. And after he married, it sort of ended his artistic career, and he became a deacon of the Dutch Reformed Church. Jan Steen. Now, he was the one who specialized in these everything going on, messy interiors, everything happening. But by the way, well, let me take you through the picture and point a few things out. This person here laughing is thought to be a self-portrait of Jan Steen. He's sitting with a young woman who's holding, this is a glass sort of suggestively. There's an old crone stoking the fire. And whenever you see that in a scene, it does suggest it could be a brothel. And there's a sort of two men or three men, two men playing cards and a woman playing, and she's looking at us and smiling because I guess this ace of diamonds she's holding is the winning card. So she knows she's going to win the game. There's a curtained bed behind them. There's a man, this man's dancing. This man is looking at this woman suggestively, although notice his bowstring is not taut. That's suggestive, but there is a knowing look. So it was quite common for whether it's a tavern or somebody's house or a brothel to be mixed together, to be ambiguous, to sort of be merged together intentionally by the artist. So you don't quite know what the situation is, and there's a lot more possibilities about what might be going on. This, by the way, in the ceiling, you might wonder what this funny is, a bell crown. It's got vines around it, but its purpose, if you notice, there's a rope hanging down. If you wanted to be served, you didn't call waiter, it's probably too noisy for that. You pulled on this and it rang the bell to attract the attention of the waitress. Another Jan Steen, Beware of Luxury. This is an interesting one, typical of Steen, and he painted a lot, 800 pictures, and most had moral points going on beneath the fun and the wit. What's going on here is we start with this woman, the best dressed woman, fur around her. She's the lady of the house and has fallen asleep, and falling asleep has allowed all manner of things to happen. The dog is eating the pie on the table. This girl here is taking something out of this cupboard on the wall. The boy is trying a pipe. There's music being played. This man and woman here are interacting with each other. She's holding a glass of wine suggestively, and he is being admonished by a nun, but he's sort of ignoring her advice. And this man behind is a Quaker, signified by the duck. Don't ask me why a duck, but a duck represents a Quaker who is reading religious texts. And meanwhile, this is another proverb. It's neither cast ye your pearls before swine. And the swine is actually, this is a rose down here. So there's lots going on, lots of mess on the floor, lots of things fallen over. And in fact, Jan Steen has become a proverb himself. In Dutch, a household of Jan Steen means one where everything is in disarray. So Jan Steen has himself become a proverb. Pieter de Hooch, The Empty Glass. A woman hands a glass to an officer, and representing soldiers and officers was quite a common genre, a common type of painting that people bought rather than sailors. There aren't many, even though in ports like Amsterdam, the taverns were full of sailors, but the fashion was to show soldiers. There's two people in the back playing cards with a third looking on. And it's similar to other paintings he produced. Two soldiers and a serving woman with a trumpeter, tavern interior with soldiers and a serving woman, and so on. And he was a contemporary of Vermeer, and he was also a member of the Delft Guild of St. Luke. Not too obvious from this picture, but if I show you another de Hooch, which you probably recognize because it's in the National Gallery, you can see the similarity to Vermeer, who was a fellow, they would have known each other well because they were both members of the same guild. And this is the more peaceful yet more intense representation of everyday life that we typically see in a Vermeer. rather than the rowdy scenes. This is a more homely scene. And Nicholas Maas, Pieter de Hooch, Jan Steen were all those that painted moral pictures, genre pictures of everyday life, rather than these quieter pictures which were produced mostly by Vermeer. I remember the other landscape painter I mentioned was Jacob van Ruysdael. He painted this when he was 18 or 19 years old and was accepted as a master in the Guild of Painters in his hometown of Haarlem when he was young. So he, again, another child prodigy. And this is this sort of landscape we see here with the path going off into the distance, the oak trees, is came to be his trademark. It's thought that these half-dead trees here, this fallen tree, represents the brevity of life. So it's a memento mori, how all things must perish. A more famous painting of his, which is in Detroit, is the Jewish cemetery. And it is an actual cemetery on the outskirts of Amsterdam, but it doesn't really look like this. The land is a lot flatter in the actual cemetery. And it's a scene with a ruined church, and I think it's a convent in the background on the top of the hill. There's a broken tree across the stream leading to this tomb, and you won't be able to read it, but the inscription on the side is Jacob van Ruysdael, the artist's signature. There are, and again, it's hard to see, but there's 3 people, 1, 2, 3. There's 3 people standing next to these tomb up here on the side of the hill. There's storm clouds, but there's also this rainbow. The suggestion is with the ruins is that is a memento mori again, but that we're all united in death. It's a Christian church and a Jewish cemetery. It's quite a large painting, you might have noticed. It's nearly 2 meters wide. In fact, one of the largest he painted. And it invokes awe and the feeling of the sublime, the overwhelming power of God and time and the natural world and the shortness of life is what it represents. If you remember at the beginning, I said that it was Nicholas Maas that inspired me to produce this talk on the Dutch Golden Age. And this was one of the paintings in the exhibition called The Eavesdropper. And what's going on here is that you notice upstairs here, there's a group of people who are sitting down for a meal. And one of them is holding up a glass, and this woman has an empty glass. This woman is the lady of the house, because she's well dressed. So she has come down to get her glass filled, probably because the servant has disappeared. Where's the maid servant gone? Well, she's come down and she's heard the maid servant being seduced by a man. You can just about see, I think, his hand on her shoulder and his other hand on her chest. And she's neglecting her duties, but rather than confront them and tell her off, the lady of the house is smiling and holding up her finger to her, say, she's sort of saying, oh, don't make a noise, let's listen, let's see what's going on here before she steps in. So there's a sort of a moral lesson here. Avoid this situation, but don't get too puritanical about it. Another Nicholas Maas, he was trained in Rembrandt's studio, but became an independent artist in Dordrecht. And he was one of the most innovative of the Dutch genre painters. And what we see here, I think, is it's not a moral in the sense of showing something wrong. It's a moral painting in the sense that it shows someone doing all the right things. It's a Dutch housewife in a spotlessly clean house, sewing a shirt. Next to her is an open Bible, showing her thoughts are morally sound. And we think the little boy at the window may imply, and her stance as well, the Proverbs 31, the virtuous woman seeketh wool and flax and worketh willingly with her hands. She stretches out her hand to the poor, yea, she reaches out her hand to the needy, is what we think this painting is representing. And then finally, the final Nicholas Mass is a woman doing the accounts, or it's sometimes called the accounts keeper. It's in America. And I'm not quite sure, I don't think, and I couldn't find anyone who was sure what this represents. It's ambiguous, like a lot of these paintings. And I think a lot of them are intentionally ambiguous. She's fallen asleep, by the way. You might think she's just looking down at the book, but in the actual painting, you can see she's fallen asleep. The map on the wall might indicate she works for a Dutch trader or trading house that trades across the world. The keys indicate she's got some sort of responsibility for the household. So she might be the bookkeeper. I suppose she could be a wife of a sole trader, and she's fallen asleep. So what are we to conclude? Well, I think we could condemn her for her laziness, or we could forgive her for working so hard. She's exhausted herself. And I think that's the intent, that the moral conundrum, the interpretation, rests with us. Vermeer, who I said I will give a talk, and the nice thing about Vermeer in a way is that I can show you all of the paintings now recognized to be by Vermeer, because there's only 34 of them. But I thought I'd end with just two. Every Vermeer, I believe, is a masterpiece, so it was difficult choosing two, and I chose them for a particular reason. This is his landscape of view of Delft. And one quote about it: he took a turbulent reality and made it look like heaven on earth, which I think is a good quote. We know when it was painted because there were bells installed in this church here in 1661. So that's why we believe it was painted in 1660-61, because there's no bells there at the moment. It was painted from an elevated position, probably the upper story of a house overlooking the river. I won't describe all the buildings there, but I'll just, I will point out that it is quite an accurate view of this corner of Delft. We're looking here, we're looking northwest, and we're looking at the Schiedam gate here. And this over here is the Rotterdam, the Schiedam gate, and the Rotterdam gate to the city. These red roof here, and well, this one behind here and over to here is the arsenal. It's the morning sun illuminating the new church. The sun is coming in across this way, right to center. This building here, I think this one is the brewery, the Papagaye, the Parrot Brewery. And this here is the old church. So if you look at a photograph of Delft, it's fairly close to this painting. So it's photographically accurate. And if you like this painting, you're in good company. Marcel Proust wrote, "Ever since I saw the view of Delft in the museum in The Hague, I have known that I had seen the most beautiful painting in the world." So that's the reason I chose this painting. And then the other painting I chose for a similar reason, one of his most popular, haunting and timeless paintings, I think. It's a Trony, by the way. You might have read Girl with a Pearl Earring, the novel, who is a story about him becoming close to a servant, and it's a portrait of her, but of course it's not intended to be a portrait. It's a representation of a European girl, a young girl, but she's wearing an Oriental turban. So it's a sort of a representation an Oriental, and Oriental turbans were very popular at the time. She has a large pearl earring, although if you're actually looking close up, this is it's painted with just a couple of strokes of the brush, and it's been wondered whether it's actually a pearl at all. It's a bit too large to be a pearl. Incidentally, there isn't any way it's connected to her ear. You might see a tiny little black mark there. That's actually just a crack in the paint. There isn't any way that it's connected to her ear, and it's just two strokes of white paint. And the bottom of the pearl is reflecting her collar here. That's this slightly mid-tone, and then the light of the room that's falling across her face here has just highlighted the other side of it. And the reason I chose it is that in 2006, the Dutch public voted it the most beautiful painting in the Netherlands. So I thought it was a fitting end to this term's talks to end with this painting. Thank you.